Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to those from the Alumni Festival and those from Newnham to Newnham College this afternoon. I'm Alison Rose. I'm the principal of Newnham. If you've never been to Newnham before, do take the chance to have a good look around the gardens after the talk. But see, this afternoon, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Hanna Strager here today. One of the things we find about Newnham is that we're constantly discovering women who did amazing things that were either not recognised in their day or have been forgotten about, and their works come to the fore since. And Inge Lehmann is one such. And our talk today, Inge Lehmann, from Newnham to the Centre of the Earth, will tell us a lot. Hanna herself is a biologist and science writer from Denmark who's dedicated her career to making science and natural history accessible to the wider public. With over 20 years of experience in science communications, she served as the Director of Exhibitions at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, where she developed engaging ways to bring scientific discoveries to life for visitors of all ages. Her outstanding work in communicating science has been recognised with the Copenhagen University Natural Science Faculty's Prize for Science Communication. Today, in her talk, Inge Lehmann from Newnham to the Centre of the Earth, she will shed light on the remarkable life and contributions of the Danish seismologist who discovered Earth's inner core, Newnham alumna Inge Lehmann, Newnham College, 1910. And one of the reasons I mentioned looking around the gardens is actually all of our Champions buildings would have been built by the time she arrived in 1910. Hanna has very kindly said she will take questions at the end, but now I will hand over to her to give us her talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come to Newnham. For me, it's an absolute thrill. It's the first time I've been here, but Newnham College has been in my mind for years. It was while I was at the Natural History Museum of Denmark that I first heard of the name Inge Lehmann. She was mentioned to me by some of the geologists at the museum, and they introduced her as the most famous scientist that nobody has ever heard of. And that included me. And it includes everybody I speak to in Denmark. We never heard of her in school, whether primary school or high school or later. She was just someone whose name was like, who is that? And because she was so unknown and still a genius, I decided that I had to dig into her life. And I applied for and got a grant from the Lundbeck Foundation, which allowed me to do exactly that. So with that in hand, I went to the National Archive of Denmark because she had passed away at this time. And I knew that all her correspondence was at the archive. And I ordered all the correspondence. I was a little bit naive because they rolled in this little chart with boxes. I think there were 13 boxes, and they were the size of if you ever buy not shoes but boots, like huge boxes full of letters, and all of it was unsorted. There were Christmas cards and birthday greetings and correspondence with the National Atmospheric Office in New York, and correspondence with our colleagues in Stanford, and more Christmas cards and newspaper clippings. And it was like something from 1932 and then something from 1982, and it was jumping back, and I was a little bit overwhelmed. But I started sorting all this out, and it turned out that it was all of her professional correspondence, except for a few Christmas cards. So although I got a pretty good view of her life as an academic, it didn't really tell me who she was as a person. And that changed when I found the box in the attic This is what every biographer always dream of doing, that there is a secret box in the attic. And in this case, there was. She never married. She didn't have children, but she had a grand nephew, and I wrote to him, and he invited me to come. He was in his 80s, and he had climbed the ladder to the attic and brought down this big cardboard box and said, "You can borrow this." So I borrowed it and I copied all the things, and it was laid out on my kitchen table for 6 months, which you can see on this picture. So I had dinner at another table for a long time because this couldn't be touched. But this also had a lot of letters from her family, to and from her family, and it gave me a very different view into who she was as a person. Because for me, as a biographer, it was also important to try to find out who was she, what was her desires, how was she as a person, not just as a scientist. And that box really helped me do that. But one thing I found in that box, which I'll read a little bit from it. I won't read a lot. I'm not a big I find it intimidating to read in a language that's not my own, but I'll try to do it anyway because this letter was quite important. It's written in 1935, and Inge was born in 1988, so she was in her 40th year. And the address at the top says Clifton Cottage, Atwick, Buffield, Yorkshire, November 29th, 1935. It says, "My dear Inge, I'm so excited. I can think of nothing but your letter. In fact, I had to go for a 4-mile walk immediately to let off steam. My uppermost thought is that I love you and I want to make you happy. But I must say that next comes the idea that I'm not at all clever at housework and not very fond of it. However, I can manage to look after myself, and at least I'm careful and would not spoil or dirty things. I have often thought that I would like to go abroad to earn my living. One gets narrow-minded living in one country." Then comes a little paragraph about a sister and whether the person writing this wants to leave the sister in England, or how, if the sister could come and visit. And then she or he writes, "I'm really well now. There was nothing much the matter with me except that I was over fatigued. However, I do not want to undertake much work until after the summer. I think that and I turned the page, of course, and there was nothing. And I looked in the whole box, and there was no continuation of the letter. And I didn't know who had written it. And my first thought was, what does it mean when you write "I love you" in England? If in Denmark you can say, I love pickled herring with beer and schnapps, or I love the way you laugh, but when you say "I love you," does that mean you really love someone, or is that just a warm way? So I asked people around from England who were native speakers who said that means you love. No doubt, and I can see you are nodding. So I was like, okay, who is this person? And first of all, is this a man or a woman? Because would a man say, "I'm not good at housework"? But did it? But perhaps it meant that I'm not very good at carpenting. I mean, I didn't know. I asked the family; they'd never heard of anyone who came to live with her in Denmark. So they were, but the nephew, who he was in his 80s, he was born the year this letter was written, so he wouldn't have known anyway. So even if there were some people who knew, they had died now. So I didn't know, and for a long time, I didn't. I started writing not knowing who the person that loved Inge Lehmann was, but it gave me it was nice knowing that somebody loved her. Oh, not that one, this one. I'm now going back to Copenhagen at the time when Inge was born. She was born in 1888, May 13th. And I think it's important to understand that the time she was born into was a time of change. It was the fin de siècle, the end of a century, and a lot of things were going on. The Stuart Mill's book, The Subjection of Woman, was published in 1869 England, and same year translated to Danish, where it made a big fuss. The Danish Women's Society was founded in 1871. The first woman in the university in Copenhagen in 1877, and also a very famous play called The Doll's House was published in 1871 and performed in Copenhagen in 1879, and also in England, in the US. And if you don't know the play, it's a place where Nora leaves her husband to seek her husband and children to seek a life that's independent, where she can, as a woman, thrive, not depending on anyone. It's a very strong play. So this was the time that Inge Lehmann was born into, and in a way, her parents were a product of this time, at least in the sense that they put her in a school, this school here, which was called Hanna Adler's School, which was a very progressive school where the children were co-educated, boys and girls, where boys took part in cooking classes and sewing classes, and girls learned fencing and played soccer with the boys. So it was very progressive, a lot more progressive than it is today, actually. And this is where she went to school, and the principal, Hanna Adler, who was, by the way, a aunt to the Niels Bohr, the famous physicist who later received the Nobel Prize and that you'll meet later on. She was a physicist herself, and she strongly believed that women had the same intellectual capacities as men, and that was her guiding principle in school. So this is what Inge learned when she went to school. Her family was a mother and a father. The father was an academic. He founded a new academic field called psychometry, I think he called it, which is how can you measure physically what goes on in your mind. So this included vision and hearing, but also dreams and other stuff. And if you think that that made him into some kind of like someone who was venturing into very unexplored fields, that's kind of true. But he was also very much the engineering type, that things that you couldn't measure really didn't exist to him. And when you read his letters, and also something which was a kind of an autobiography where he describes himself in third person, which is pretty weird. You also think that he was really weird. I think he was. Today we would have called him something, I think, and he proudly wrote that he was different from other people. He didn't see himself as someone who was like other people. He didn't want to go to dinner parties as a child. He didn't want to play with other children. He was really a loner. Inge was the first born in the family. Her mother, of course, was a housewife. And then she had a little sister called Harriet. And those were the two sisters. There were no brothers in the family. So Inge graduated from high school from Hanna Adler's School, and at that time she was desperate to get out of the country, not just to do something, but just to get out. She wanted to get away. And when I read her diaries and her letter from when she was young, I see a sad and very lonely person, and terribly shy, to the point where it's almost debilitating. She wrote when she was 13, she considered suicide the first time in her life, and decided against it because you have to achieve something before you die. And in a way, I think she also thought that suicide was kind of, that's what losers do. But she didn't really think there was any joy in living for a long, long, long time. That she couldn't find the joy. She was so uncomfortable with other people. She was embarrassed. She didn't thrive in school, and her parents were worried about her. They were constantly worried about if school and studying was too hard for her. And that became something that came up later. So she didn't. She applied for a job to go to be a nanny or a private teacher in the Danish Virgin Islands in the West Indies, which at that time was a Danish colony, but was later in 2008, no, 1918 was sold to the US. So actually, you can sell estate to the US, but we don't do it anymore. So Greenland is off the table. But that time it was done. But she applied for a job to get as far away as she could. She didn't get it, and in the end, she had to accept a job as a private teacher in this mansion, which was also in Denmark, but at least 3 hours and a ferry ride away from her family. And I think it was very much about getting away from her family. I think the mother suffered from depressions, but of course it wasn't called depressions at that time. But there are hints in the letters between the mother's mother-in-law and other family members saying, your mother's nervous tendencies and your mother's can't cope with this. And also Inge writing to her mother, you have to go to Norway and relax, mother, because it's good for you. And I mean, there's all these things that children do when they have a parent that's not doing well. They try to take care of them, and she was doing that. And I think this added to her whole feeling of not thriving in her own home. And of course, the little sister was everything she wasn't. She was charming, outgoing, beautiful, wanted to be an actor, and eventually became an actor. So she also had this sister in the house who was, like a glowing sun and overshadowing her. I think, although Inge never complained about it, I think at times it must have been difficult. But she really, really wanted to go abroad. And in 1908, she started studying mathematics at the Copenhagen University. Not something her father encouraged. He didn't want her to do it. He think you can take 1 or 2 courses, but don't enroll. It's going to be too much for you. It's dangerous for young women to study. It can break them down. And partly to get away from this, she applied to get into Newnham College and was accepted and went in 1910. And the first 3 or 4 months after she started here, just like from October to Christmas, we don't hear much. But after Christmas, the correspondence between her and her mother really picks up, and it's all about that she wants to stay there. She's not coming home. In fact, she writes, I want to stay here forever. And of course, the parents are worried about this. Are you sure that's a good idea? And you know that it can cost you your health. And so there was all this correspondence going back and forth between the family, with the mother as a mediator and the father saying it's going to cost too much. We can't afford it. I don't have money enough to do this. But even despite all this going on, she decided that she wanted to do the mathematical tripos, and she wanted to do it in 2 years, which is a big feat, but she knew it could be done. She was a very good friend with Muriel Hill, and Muriel Hill's brother is Archibald Vivian Hill, also a Nobel Prize winner, and he had just done it in 2 years. So she knew it could be done, and she had to do it fast because the family couldn't afford to have her here for 3 or 4 years. So she declared she was going to do that, and she would do it in 2 years. And eventually, her father caved and said, "Okay, you can go back." And she was really, really happy. So she went back in the summer holidays to Denmark, and then she returned in the fall of 1911. And she had not been here for a month before the whole thing collapsed. She had to write to her mother. I think it's I'm not doing well. I don't know what to do. I have a stomach pain. My hair is falling out. I cannot sleep. And for a while, I wasn't sure what this was about. Inge writes in like a few biographical notes that she delivered to the Royal Society much later in her life. She said, I overworked. This is how she described it. And I don't know exactly what it was. I know for sure that she was not physically sick because every day her friend Muriel would come, get her out of bed, go for a walk with her, and so she was fine enough for walking, but there was something mentally wrong. And her parents wanted her to come home immediately, and she refused. She gave up taking the math exam that was scheduled around Christmas, but she wanted to take the English essay, which was the what is that called when you have to take that, you have to pass that exam to be accepted to go on with the mathematical tripos. So she needed that ticket. So even although she was bedridden for a long time, she decided that I'm not going home. I'm going to take that exam so I can come back. All this time, Niels Bohr had arrived at the same time, and he was, if not a friend of the family, they at least knew him. He was also here at the same time, and I think perhaps it contributed to the whole feeling of failure. He becomes this national hero. He was already a hero in Denmark because if nothing else, then because his brother was on the National League in football. But they were both very famous because they were brilliant geniuses. And she was invited to teas and lunches with Niels Bohr. And I think that was very prestigious, and she couldn't really cope. So it was a huge failure to go home for Christmas. But she knew she would come back because she passed the English exam. And in this box, there was still this document saying that the English exam was passed. That was her ticket back. But she never came back. Um, but it, but I'll come back to how big a role Newnham College played, because contrary to the life in Denmark where she didn't thrive, where she wanted to commit suicide, here she was thriving. She was blossoming. She was having fun. She had friends. They had tea parties. They went rowing. She was a really strong, athletic woman. She played tennis. She swam in the sea. She biked. She did all these things. And she was, tall and blonde. I'm sure she stood out a little bit. I think she also felt that somehow she had become popular. Uh, and I cannot completely rule out that she had fallen in love. What else could make someone say you want to stay here for the whole rest of your life and you're so desperate to come back? At least as a biographer, I think, is that a possibility? Was that why she was thriving and blossoming so much? I don't I don't have a definite answer to that, so it's an open question, but I'll tell you a little bit about how she recovered after she came back. So she came back around just before Christmas in 1911, and the next many years was very quiet, and I have very few letters from that time of her life. She had to accept a job at an insurance company as calculator of risk, which is where you use people who are good at math. And then she had friends. She had girlfriends from Newnham College. I already mentioned Muriel. I know there was also somebody called Florence. There was Lorna. There was a whole list of friends that she corresponded with. And also, a few years after, she went back to see them, and some of them came to Denmark to see her. Ebbe Strand-Bigård was a woman that she had known for a long time, and she became like a beacon of light for her, someone she could always go to. and who was a very strong-willed character and much sturdier and more stable mentally than Inge was. And then there was Amalie, who was the housewife where she was the private teacher in that big mansion you saw the picture of. And then, of course, her mother, her grandmother, her sister, and even eventually a niece. So this was what kept her life together in those years. But there's a lot I don't know. As a biographer, you have to accept that there are holes. So there are even years where I'm not sure if she lived in Denmark or Norway. At some place, she writes that she had an address in Norway for half a year or a year and a half. That's a little bit uncertain. I have no idea what she was doing there. She writes, at one time I was about to immigrate to Canada. This was also in this time of period. I have no idea what she wanted to do in Canada. I'm perplexed by that. She got engaged to be married. I think I found out who that was, but she cut off the engagement. And instead, she started studying at the Copenhagen University again in 1918, and she graduated in 1920. And now we come back to Niels Bohr. You see him, he's sitting here. It's his brother Harald here. And there are two other brothers. This is Niels Erik Nørlund and his brother, I think, Paul Nørlund. And then a guy called Mr. Rubin. But Niels Erik Nørlund, we're going to stay a little bit with. So these are the academic upper class in Copenhagen. And Niels Erik Nørlund became her boss. And I think he became her boss because he knew her, because his parents and her grandparents were neighbors in a small provincial town. So he has probably known her all his life. And he knew she was very good at math. He was a professor at mathematics at the university. And he invited her to have a job. And in the end, this job led to a position in the first Institute of Geodesy in Denmark. And Niels Erik Nørlund was a quite ambitious man, I think I would call it, and also someone who had a vision. So he knew that in Norway and in Sweden, they had already installed seismic stations. And I think he thought it was a disgrace that Denmark didn't have anyone when the two other Scandinavian countries had. So he wrote like an indignant letter to the war ministry and some other ministries saying we need to have it when they have it in Norway and Sweden. And so he had very strong persuasive power, and they bought free seismographs that arrived in the basement of this building where all these people were sitting. These are all officers in the military because the Institute of Geodesy is very strongly connected to cartography and to the military. And in the basement below where they are sitting, these seismographs were lined up. And Inge described, because she was working here, what happened. Because it turned out that they didn't really know how to install them or get them to work. And one day she said, Niels Erik Nørlund, her boss, came and he grabbed some of the other officers and said, let's go down and see if we can find out. And she went along, even though she wasn't invited to, and she found out. It wasn't easy, but after I had looked at them closely, I managed to figure out how to do it. So she was the one who found out. And since that day, she worked on seismology and seismographs. And I think credit to Niels Erik Nørlund, he recognized that she was right and she could do it. So he actually gave her the position as state geodesist and sent her on a tour of Europe to train as a seismologist. So he sent her to Benno Gutenberg in Darmstadt in Germany. And Benno Gutenberg was probably one of the best in Europe in seismology, and he was very generous and trained her very well. He was Jewish, And for that reason, he fled Germany in, I think, 1929. He couldn't get a position, and he ended up in Stanford. And her job as a state geodesist was actually just to read the seismographs. And now it gets a little bit hairy now. But so a seismogram like this has first a P wave, which is a primary wave, and then a secondary wave, which are called S waves. So Inge's job was to put these seismograms together in the bulletins, which was available to seismologists all over the world. But she started studying them herself. And the whole idea of studying what goes on inside the Earth was pretty much caused by a huge earthquake, the biggest that's been in Europe in 1755 in Lisbon, which wrecked the whole city and caused an enormous tsunami that killed 40,000, 60,000, 100,000, depends on what resources you look at. But lots and lots of people got killed. But this was also at the time of Enlightenment, so it also created let's try to understand what causes earthquakes. And that's why we started studying earthquakes and seismograms. And here comes Harold Jeffreys. He's at St. John's College here in Cambridge. He became a very good friend and ally of Inge Lehmann. He was years ahead of her in terms of working with this, although they were about the same age, but she had all these years where she dropped out. So he found out, this is the hairy part. So if you have an earthquake up here, the S waves, the secondary waves, they can't go through anything that's liquid. They just stop. They just don't go through. And because you don't, when you have an earthquake, you don't get any readings of S waves here, which that's called the shadow zone of the S waves. He said that means there must be the whole core of Earth must be liquid. That was what he found out, because the S waves don't get through, and they can't go through any liquid mass. So that's, we can all understand that, I think. Here comes the hairy part. So now forget about S waves. Now we're looking at the P waves, the primary waves, which are smaller than the S waves. They can go through liquids. And therefore, if you look at the core here, that's fluid. When they go through the liquid, they are bended, just like light is refracted when it meets another medium and it meets water. So they are bended inwards. And that means there's a shadow zone here, because all these orange lights there or lines there are bended inwards. So the shadow zone of the P waves is here. But Inge's discovery was that she found P waves where they shouldn't be, in the shadow zone of the P waves. He said they can only be there if on the way through the core they meet something inside which is not liquid and causes them to bend, accelerate and bend outwards again. That's the only reason that we can see that there's a signal in the shadow zone. This is Inge's fame, this diagram here. And it's caused, these readings are from an earthquake in New Zealand in 1929, and Inge worked on it for 3 or 4, she worked on it for 5, 6 years before she published it. And this is when she wrote to her friend Harold Jeffreys, who maintained that the core was fluid. She wrote, "If I'm right, and I know I am." And she was right. It didn't make her famous. It was a huge discovery. It actually, I think most biographies of Harold Jeffreys, the nice gentleman you saw from St. John's College, it says that he discovered that the core is fluid. But I mean, so that's his fame. But it took a long time before she was recognized. She was ready to, she quit her job. She resigned. She was retiring when she's been 25 years and she was 65 years old. She retired. She didn't get a job at the University of Copenhagen in geophysics as a professor. They didn't even, she applied for it, but they decided that no, we don't think no, 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 we're not doing it. Took them 12 years to decide who they would. They definitely didn't want her. But in the meantime, she met Maurice Ewing, who is a seismologist from the Lamont Geological Observatory at Columbia University, and he invited her to come to the States and study there. And this became her second career. And after she retired, she had a new career. It's a good thing she lived to be 104 years old. But she actually wrote more scientific papers after she retired than before. She was really, really productive. And that whole period of her academic life was in the States, primarily working with Maurice Ewing, but after a while also with some of his PhD students who started having independent careers. And one thing, I just want to make a small note here about earthquakes and continents, because at the same time, we're talking about Inge Lehmann's life from 1888 to 1993. This is also the time in geophysics where the academic world is discussing this whole idea of continental drift. And it plays a big role in my book because it is so integrated with understanding what earthquakes are and how they work. Because if you plot this is the work from the Lamont Geological Observatory, where they found out that there are not only do we have these ridges all over the world, but there are rifts in them. They are splitting apart, and something is still happening. It's not just a still picture we're looking at. It's very dynamic. And if you mark where all the earthquakes are, they are all like pearls on a string in these rifts. And this is where Inge Lehmann's work in earthquakes and the theory of continental drift, they kind of overlap. So it's just to mention that we think, does it matter much what goes on inside the earth? No, not to our daily life, but it does matter in our understanding of our own planet and how it works. Did she get recognition? Yes, but primarily because Maurice Ewing, he did this. He thought she was a genius, and he made sure she got the first award in 1960. It's called the Harry Oscar Wood Award. And then, as you can see here, they started coming year by year. She did get some recognition in Denmark. The Royal Danish Academy of Sciences awarded her the gold medal in 1965 after Carol Jeffries had written to Niels Bohr saying, don't you really think you should recognize that she should get a medal? And so it was, he pushed that and she got the medal, but they never invited her into the society. I think primarily because there weren't any women in the society. So it wasn't just her, but it's still a disgrace. And the Copenhagen University, very late, also gave her an honorary doctorate. So I think if you asked her, of course we can't do that, I think she would say, yes, I was definitely recognized. But if you ask me, as somebody who's gone to school in Denmark and has been interested in science, no, she wasn't, because we don't know her. We all know who Niels Bohr is, and lots of other people who are famous for this or that, but we never heard of her. But it's starting to change. There are a lot of things I don't know about Inge Lehmann. Why did she want to stay in England? I already said, was it because she had fallen in love with someone? Was it more social than the academics? And I definitely think it was, because when she was very old, and I found a notebook, and the handwriting is very shaky, but she's written a few things, and a lot of it is about Newnham. Newnham meant the world to her. This is where I think she had the happiest time of her youth, was here. Um, I also found out who wrote the letter. Because she wrote in this notebook with the shaky handwriting, she wrote, Florence Sykes came to stay with me for a while in Denmark. And she wrote a few more lines about her. And then I had what is it called, a historian, somebody who works with heritage and things like that here in England. So can you help me find out something about Florence Sykes, who studied here at Newnham? She graduated in mathematics from Newnham and was, I think, a student from 1908. And she owned that cottage where the letter was sent from. So I'm no longer in doubt that Florence wrote that letter. I also have another letter that I found later where she's writing to Inge. No, actually, I should find it because it's very nice. I should read 2 lines from it. She's writing. My dear Inge, your letter was so kind and generous. It makes me long to be with you. This is in December 35, a month after the first letter. Florence was happy to cycle and bring her own bike with her, even though it was old and heavy. Should she buy a typewriter in England and take it with her, or should she wait until she got to Denmark? Florence thought it was better to have a housekeeper who did not live in the house, so they would not have to feel responsible for her well-being in the evening. She was not afraid of the dark or robbers, and she hoped the dog they were going to have was not too big. She preferred a bedroom that was cool and fresh and had lots of light. Yes, so Florence went to stay with Inge. I don't have any letters from Inge indicating her feelings for Florence, so I'm not going to say what kind of relationship they had. I don't know that. I hope they loved each other, but I don't know. And the reason I bring this into a biography is that I think it may help us understand some of the anxiety and shyness and mental problems she had if she was also facing a whole society that was not accepting of her living with another woman. To me, it there's things that starts to make sense. I don't know if I'll find more letters shedding more light on this at some point. I hope. I like to say, just to sum up a few things here at the end, with the questions that I often get. Was her discovery really groundbreaking? Who cares? If our life is just the same, whether the earth is solid inside or fluid. Nothing really changes. It's not like the cure of cancer or anything. It's, but you know, what it changes is our understanding of our own planet. And that matters. It matters that we have insights into the whole planetary system and how it works. And if I talk to geophysicists, and I'm not a geophysicist, they would say, well, it does matter also to our understanding about uh, where the North and the South Pole is, and if they're changing, it really matters if they're fluid or not. So it does have some implication. But there are discoveries which is about how we understand ourselves and the place we live. And this discovery is one of those. And for that, it is really groundbreaking. I'm also asked if she experienced discrimination if she was a woman. And I think, of course she did. I mean, that goes beyond, I mean, of course she did, lots of it. And she also described it herself. There's a letter where she's referring to a book by Perlis Buck about women in China who are always walking behind the men and who were never getting credit for anything. And it's very obvious that she's identifying with those women. And but I'm not always sure if that's why she was not recognized. It's not the only reason she is not recognized. I think it was the reason she didn't get the professorship at a university. But all the lack of recognition, why we don't know her in Denmark and why most people have never heard of it, is also that her field is I mean, when she was a seismologist in Denmark, she was the only one for decades. So there was no one who understood the greatness of what she was doing, at least for Niels Bohr. He had lots of colleagues who were all admiring what he did, but she had nobody except Maurice Ewing at Columbia who admired what she was doing. So for somebody to get recognition, there has to be someone who understands what you were doing, and nobody did. So that, I think, it plays a big role. And this one, of course, I have I have replied to now. And that's pretty much it. I guess I'm happy to take questions.
Oh, I can see the microphone coming already, and I can see you've slightly you've asked all the questions yourself, but it looks as though one or two people might have a few others. So yes, come aside.
Wasn't part of Danish society in quite the same way, so that may have helped her. But what it sounds like her illness is that she, like her mother, had an episode of depression, and that quite commonly occurs in people who are autistic, because actually it's quite difficult to live in our society if you're like that. Okay, so you might wish to explore those.
Yeah, yeah. So if I understood it correctly, I don't know if it was a question or if it was a reflection. The idea that her father was on the autism spectrum somewhere has certainly occurred to me, but I'm not a psychiatrist or I don't know anything about this, so I'm very cautious about not suggesting anything where I'm not an expert. But he clearly is odd, and that's his own word, so I can say it too. The mother, I think, may have suffered from depressions, and I think Inge may have had a dash of both or all of it. I asked her family, her living family, who she said she was what did they say? She was not always cheerful, they said. But they didn't think she was autistic at all. But what do I know? Yeah. I don't know. It's possible, very possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, one at the back. Microphone's coming to you.
I just wonder if Newnham has any records of her time here. Which room was she in? Do you know any of her activities when she was at college? I mean, you mentioned sports. Was she on sports teams?
Emma, do you want to come up? I mean, there may be more in the book. I think you should say a little bit more about it.
I can say a little bit about it. I've worked with the archivists in Newnham, and there are not many records, but you already told me one that I didn't know then, that she was volunteering to inspect the...
Come up to the microphone.
Yes, we think she was... I did some little bit of work at our observatory when we had it on site working, and various people over the years have been a keeper of the telescope, and we think that she did get involved with that. and you said Peel was her.
Yeah,
All of it,
yeah,
yeah.
her room was in Peel.
Which was newly opened the year she arrived.
Yeah.
So it must have been just the first occupant
Yeah,
of whichever room she had.
And she slept at the roof in the summertime.
Yes. Well, you have some record of that, but we don't know about that, and we don't encourage that kind of thing. But I'm sure Frida, who's our archivist, couldn't be here today, unfortunately, but I'm sure she would be able to answer any questions about any records we have. And maybe
but I think there's
correspondence
little,
between.
but maybe when there's a little bit more focus, more can pop up.
I'm conscious of the fact that the Alumni Festival have so many talks on. That's why people are leaving, because they're trying to get to their 3 o'clock.
Yes, of course.
So they're really jamming in. But people who are here, any other questions? Yes.
Do we know if her younger sister became an actress?
Yes, she did.
She did.
She did.
And she died before.
She died long before Inge herself.
Yeah.
They actually fell out with each other in the 20s, primarily, I think, because the sister was outgoing, and maybe because her husband died of the Spanish flu in 1918, I think, and then they lost the daughter as well. So it's very sad. But because the sister was so outgoing, seeing men, maybe seeing someone who is married, there's some indications of that, and I think Inge strongly disagreed with that. So they had a big fallout, and although they were on speaking terms, they never really got close again.
Anything else? Well, I think you could stay behind a few minutes if people have things.
Absolutely, of course.
But I have a feeling that a number of us will be saying, if I'm right, and I know I am, I think we'll all be going home to look in our attics. I certainly, as a former diplomat, would totally agree with the one gets narrow-minded, always living in one country. Well, perhaps I'd put it more positively, one gets broader-minded if one lives in more countries. But I also, apart from the fact, as I said at the beginning, that there are so many women who were not recognised for what they did, I think this sense that my experience is that often women blossom later in their careers than men do. And that's something we have to be really mindful of, that I think perhaps it's better now than it was then, that some people do blossom early and that's fine. Some of us blossom later, and that's really important. I say to all my students, you're not the finished article when you're 21, and she certainly wasn't, and blossomed much, much later in life. Hannah, thank you so much. We have a small gift. Oh, so thank you very much. I hope that's going to travel back to Copenhagen.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you very much indeed.